Hey guys, welcome back, or maybe just welcome. If this is your first time wandering into one of these late-night rambles through history's stranger corners, go ahead and dim the lights, put the phone on that do not disturb mode, and if you've got a blanket, now's the time to pull it up. Tonight, we're going to talk about something very fashionable, and also very fatal. Yes, fashion trends that could, and occasionally did, literally kill you. Because apparently looking good has always been worth dying for. So let's just float back a few centuries to Europe, where the wealthy and powerful were always finding new ways to show off their status. You'd think jewels, castles, and armies would be enough. But no, sometimes the real flex was making your outfit so impractical, it might actually shorten your life. Take, for example, the delightful medieval trend of the poulaines. These were shoes with tips so long they curled up like something straight out of a cartoon elf sketch. Except instead of being jolly, these shoes were dangerous. Some poulaines stretched out to 20 inches beyond the actual foot. The longer your shoe, the higher your rank, or at least, that's what everyone wanted others to think. Of course, they made walking nearly impossible, and knights actually had to cut off the tips before battle so they could fight. Imagine preparing for war and needing a shoe alteration just to survive. Very practical, very intimidating. Nothing says, "Fear me," like hobbling around in what are essentially medieval clown shoes. Now, let's slide forward a bit to the Renaissance and early modern period, where the danger level escalated. Enter the corset. Ah yes, the iconic garment that squeezed, pressed, and reshaped women's bodies into the fashionable hourglass form. On paper, sure, it created that elegant silhouette. In practice, it sometimes crushed ribs, restricted breathing, and shifted organs around like furniture in a cramped apartment. Doctors of the time occasionally warned about tight lacing. But honestly, most of society seemed to shrug and say, "Beauty hurts," which it did, sometimes permanently. There are even reports of women fainting so frequently in public that fainting couches became a literal piece of household furniture. Imagine designing furniture just to collapse onto because your clothes were cutting off your lung capacity. And speaking of lungs, let's not forget the powdered wigs and cosmetics craze of the 17th and 18th centuries. At first glance, these giant wigs look like a fun bit of theater. They were fluffy, powdered, and sometimes decorated with tiny ships or bird cages. Because subtlety was not really the point here. The darker side? That powder was often laced with lead, mercury, and other heavy metals that slowly poison the wearer. Combine that with lead-based face makeup and rouge, and you had entire courts of elites glowing with a pale, luminous beauty, while quietly damaging their skin, their nervous systems, and, well, their odds of survival. It wasn't just a bad skincare routine, it was basically self-applied chemical warfare. But wigs weren't only toxic, they were also little ecosystems. Lice were a constant problem, and some aristocrats had to hire servants specifically to maintain and delouse their hairpieces. Nothing says luxury quite like needing a full-time employee to pick bugs out of your head. And because wigs were sometimes coated in animal fat to help the powder stick, rats could be attracted to them. Picture this. You're at a glamorous ball, looking stunning, when a rat decides to scurry into your carefully coiffed headpiece. Truly the height of sophistication. We could drift across the channel to France, where fashion excess reached Olympian levels under figures like Marie Antoinette. She became famous for hairstyles so tall and elaborate, they practically defied physics. Some of them stood over 3 feet high and required scaffolding-like support. Wigs took hours to assemble, and because of their size, women often had to sleep sitting up just to preserve the structure. Try relaxing when your head is balanced under a powdered mountain of fake hair. Not the most restful experience. And yet, these styles weren't just impractical. They could also be dangerous. Imagine leaning too close to a candle at a party, with all that powder, perfume, and hairspray-like concoctions. There were more than a few reports of wigs catching fire. Nothing like a literal blazing crown to make an entrance at Versailles. Let's float gently to another risky fashion choice. One that sounds almost innocent, the crinoline. Picture enormous hoop skirts made of steel or whalebone, spreading fabric out in a massive circle. They were the Victorian must-have, creating that wide bell-shaped silhouette we always see in paintings and films. The problem? They were also massive fire hazards. Skirts sometimes brushed against open flames from candles or fireplaces. And with so much fabric, they went up fast. There are reports of women burning alive because their crinolines caught fire before anyone could help. It's one of those tragedies that sounds like an urban legend, but it happened often enough to make newspapers. Victorian fashion was not exactly OSHA approved. So already, between clown shoes, suffocating corsets, poisonous wigs, and flammable skirts, we're starting to see a theme here. Fashion has always been a little bit life-threatening. But of course, society kept doubling down. Because why not risk everything if it meant impressing your peers for a few fleeting moments of glamour? Alright, so we've already shuffled past poulaines, corsets, wigs, and crinolines. You'd think at some point people would look around and say, maybe fashion that kills us is a bad idea. But no. If anything, the 19th century said, let's make this even deadlier. One of the most famous examples is the lovely shade known as arsenic-green. This was an artificial pigment invented in the late 1700s and popular throughout the 1800s. It gave dresses, wallpaper, even toys a dazzling emerald glow. The problem? That particular glow came from arsenic. Yes, arsenic. The poison. The one that shows up in every detective story. People wore it, touched it, even slept in rooms covered with it. The dye gave off toxic particles and dust, so a fashionable evening gown could literally poison both the woman wearing it and the unlucky people sitting nearby. Victorian doctors started noticing young women in stunning green dresses suddenly falling ill. Nausea, rashes, organ failure. Some even died. And yet, the shade stayed trendy for decades. Imagine strolling into a ball, twirling in your glittering green gown, while slowly absorbing poison with every breath. Deadly chic. And it wasn't just clothing. Makeup loved a good toxic ingredient. Lead was still in heavy rotation, especially in powders meant to give you that ghostly pale look. Mercury was used in skin creams and cosmetics. Women weren't alone in this, by the way. Men were happily poisoning themselves too, especially when it came to hair tonics and dyes. It seems everyone was just competing to see who could look the best while shaving a few years off their life expectancy. Let's also not skip over parasols and fans. On the surface, these look harmless, even dainty. But the dyes, again, were dangerous. Some parasols and fabrics were colored with aniline dyes that irritated skin and stained hands a lovely chemical purple. Even gloves weren't safe. Reports circulated about arsenic-green gloves literally burning holes in women's fingers. Nothing says glamorous like dissolving fingertips. Speaking of accessories, hats were their own health hazard. The phrase "mad as a hatter" didn't come from nowhere. Hat makers in the 18th and 19th centuries used mercury nitrate to treat felt. Over time, workers absorbed the mercury through their skin and lungs, leading to tremors, hallucinations, and full-on neurological damage. It wasn't so much the wearers who were at risk, but the makers themselves. Entire communities of hatters slowly poisoned by their trade, all for the sake of making sure the upper classes had a properly stylish top hat to wear to the opera. Now, footwear deserves another honorable mention. We already touched on medieval poulaines, but later centuries weren't exactly kinder to the human body. In the 1500s, Chopins became the must-have shoe in Venice. These were platform heels, but on steroids. Some were over 20 inches high, turning every stroll into an extreme sport. Women often needed servants to help them walk without falling, which, let's be real, was the ultimate humble brag. Yes, I'm so rich and stylish I literally cannot move without hired assistance. But falls were common, and broken bones came with the territory. Basically, they invented high heels, cranked them up to an absurd height, and then acted surprised when people toppled over. By the Victorian era, shoes weren't necessarily collapsing women onto cobblestones anymore, but they did start doing permanent damage. Tight boots and narrow-toed shoes crushed feet, deformed bones, and created bunions that could last a lifetime. And remember, this is an age when anesthesia wasn't exactly modern. Surgery for your fashion-induced foot deformities was not a pleasant affair. Let's drift briefly east, because Europe wasn't the only region where fashion came with a body count. In China, the practice of foot binding had been around since the Song dynasty. The goal was to create the so-called lotus foot, a tiny, arched shape considered the peak of feminine beauty. The reality was excruciating. Young girls' feet were broken, wrapped tightly, and forced to grow in on themselves. The pain was constant, infections were common, and walking became a struggle for life. But in elite circles, it was a sign of refinement. So once again, status trumped survival. And just in case we thought men were free of these burdens, let's circle back to Europe one more time. Because some men really wanted to match the absurdity. In the late Renaissance, codpieces were all the rage. These padded or even armored fabric pouches emphasized, well, exactly what you think they emphasized. Some codpieces were stuffed with materials like sawdust or bran to give them a heroic bulge. Others doubled as storage pockets. Yes, you could literally keep coins or keys in there. Function meets fashion. While they weren't as directly lethal as arsenic gowns, codpieces did encourage tight, heavy layers of fabric in very delicate areas. Combine that with early modern hygiene, and infections weren't exactly rare. Not a medical textbook's dream case. So by now, we've drifted through shoes that broke bones, corsets that crushed ribs, dyes that poisoned you, hats that drove makers insane, and wigs that could catch fire or house a family of rodents. It paints a clear picture. Fashion has almost always asked, how much are you willing to suffer for status? And the answer, historically, has been quite a lot, actually. But maybe that's part of the story. These clothes, wigs, shoes, and dyes weren't just vanity. They were signals of wealth, of power, of belonging to an elite world where you could afford to literally risk your life for appearances. Fashion wasn't just about beauty. It was about showing off that you had the resources to endure discomfort, danger, or even early death, all while looking fabulous. And with that, we'll close our little wander through the fashion hazards of history. So next time you slip on a pair of uncomfortable shoes or complain about skinny jeans, just remember, at least they probably won't catch fire, poison you, or break your ribs. Probably.